Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join us for this webinar, Assessments 101. We are joined today by Kimberly Kraft, who is Director of State and Government Partnerships at NWEA. Kimberly joined NWEA in 2013 and leads a team dedicated to advising state-level stakeholders regarding assessment solutions. She has more than 15 years of diversified experience serving the education and assessment industry. This experience includes working as a district administrator in Broward County Public Schools in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, as a measurement consultant for hardcore assessment, and as a director of custom programs for Pearson Learning Assessment. Ms. Kraft has proven experience in program management, strategic planning, training, and implementation, presentations, and account management. This is Michelle Ekstrom at the National Conference of State Legislators, and we are so pleased to have Kimberly joining us today to cover a topic that we know is very important to state legislators and legislative staff. So at this time, I will ask Kimberly to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm delighted to be here and talking to all of you about assessments and the different types and purposes of assessments, but also the different value that assessments provide in the K-12 education system. Let's start with kind of a broad overview of really what is assessment. And it can be defined many ways. I'm kind of partial to defining assessment as a verb, the process of using evidence to improve decision making. And I think it's really critical to emphasize the importance of assessment as a verb, as an action, because assessments themselves, right, are only valuable in the sense that we act upon and follow up on the results of those assessments to help yield data. It's important to select the appropriate tool or assessment for the job, which is kind of the noun definition. But for me, and for NWEA particularly, it's really about the process of using assessment in the learning cycle and how our district and school and teacher partners are using the evidence provided by our assessments to make instructional decisions and adjustments. It's also about conferencing with students about their learning, helping them make connections in their understanding or understand where they have misconceptions, and coaching students to be better consumers of their own evidence so that they can apply information to answer the questions, where am I going, where am I now, and how will I get there? So defining that path forward. If we think about some of the reasons, it's really important that we ask some basic questions when we think about assessments. What do we assess? What are the things that we think are most important to evaluate? How do we define the criteria or characteristics of what we're going to assess and evaluate? How do we assess? What is the process by which we collect our assessment data? Is it important that that process is standardized, which means that it's the same for every student that participates in the process? Or is it more important that it's individualized to allow each student their own path forward with the assessments? And lastly, why do we assess? Why is this information important to collect? And again, I'll emphasize that for NWEA, we really think it's the action that's taken as the result of assessments being administered than the fact that you're administering the assessments themselves. And it's those follow-up actions that are really important and critical to the assessment process and to the good use of assessment data in schools and districts. I'd like to ask you to think about the decisions that different educational stakeholders need to make as a result of assessment data. And that ranges from the very basic at the individual student level, thinking about that student who wants to know, what do I need to do to improve in my next assignment, all the way up to the policymaker level, to our legislators, to our governors, to those working in state agencies regarding whether the process and the policies that are being implemented around education, does the assessment data show that those policies are having a positive impact, and that it's important to continue to fund, for example, a statewide reading intervention. It's just important to think about different stakeholders approach assessment with different needs in mind. Let's drill into each of these a little bit in more detail. We start with the student level, and students are really interested in assessment feedback because they need to be able to report on their own learning and understand what progress is being made. Assessment data can be used both to motivate and encourage students, but alternatively, it can be disheartening or demotivating to students if it's presented in an inappropriate way. Students are also using assessments to help understand what's expected of them, right? What does their performance need to be, and how to evaluate for themselves where they stand in their learning. And it also helps students to build independence and ownership of their own learning. It's important that students understand the purpose and the intent of the assessment so that they can support the process and be active participants in the process, as opposed to assessment being done to students. Moving up to the parent level, right? Parents are extremely interested in assessment results. They want to be informed about their children's achievements and readiness for advancement. They also want to understand if there are consequences tied to a particular assessment for their student. Parents want to help connect what they're doing at home with the efforts at the school to support children's learning. So what can I do as a parent to help support what my child is learning in school? And they want to be able to compare the performance of their individual student and the school their child attends with other students at the same grade level or with other schools across the district, across the state, and even sometimes across the country. And lastly, they use the assessment data to make informed decisions about their child's education. Parents want to know, is my child learning? Is my child growing from where he or she started? Are they on grade level? How do they compare to other students at their grade level? And what can I do as a parent to support my child? Teachers, both individually or as part of a learning community, use assessments to inform instruction and to personalize learning. They need to understand, what do my students already know about a particular topic? What did they learn as a result of my instruction? And how can they apply that new learning? Assessments help teachers to diagnose student strengths and weaknesses, and to determine where and when they need to intervene if students are not progressing as expected. It also helps teachers to evaluate their students against a particular standard and assign grades to those students. So there's an evaluative component for teachers. When you move up to the school and district administrator level, your assessment information is being used a little differently, right? It's being used more to evaluate than it is to support instruction. Here, school administrators as well as district leaders want to be able to determine program effectiveness. Is the intervention or a curriculum and instruction that we're using effective in reaching students and helping to support their learning? They also use the information to determine resource allocation. Do I need to do something different in this particular school or this particular classroom to better support learning? And to support their teachers' professional development. It helps them identify where teachers may have some gaps and needs and intervene at the teacher level to provide the right tools and professional learning to teachers to support their growth and development. And then lastly, schools and districts need to be able to support school and teacher accountability. We've heard a lot about teacher evaluation based on assessment, and certainly assessment data is one important component of how we identify our teachers that are the strongest, the best performing teachers in a school or district. It also helps us identify those teachers who might not be doing as well, might need some additional professional learning, coaching, and mentoring, or support through the school, or who ultimately might need to be coached out of the profession because they're not having the desired outcomes and impacting students in the most beneficial way. And we know the importance for students of having an effective teacher in their classroom. The research supports that teacher effectiveness is the biggest determinant of student success. Lastly, when you start to think about state administrators, again, the lens goes up to an even higher level, and more importantly, that assessment data is going to be used for evaluative purposes to determine if programs that are implemented across the state are being effective. Is an early literacy, early intervention program working as expected? It helps the state to evaluate schools and teachers for accountability purposes and determine where additional intervention might be needed, as well as where additional supports might be needed, and using that information to inform that resource allocation. Policymakers, similarly, use assessment data to help guide their decisions. And again, it's about understanding school and district performance for the purposes of accountability. It's about informing the public of school performance and progress at the school level of the K-12 education system in a state, and to ensure appropriate resource allocation across the state. But lastly, policymakers have questions to answer about return on investment, right, and demonstration that funding is being well spent. So in a state where you have a pre-kindergarten or a statewide kindergarten program, you want to be sure that the assessment data supports that there are benefits to students and to educational outcomes as a result of that funding, for example. So as we think about all of the assessment stakeholders that are involved in this process, there are different types of assessments that better meet the needs of different stakeholders in the system. And the fact of the matter is that if I can leave you with one strong message today, it is that assessment purpose really drives design or selection of the type of assessment that's being used. And I will confess, having worked in this industry for more than 15 years, as Michelle described, I can acknowledge that there is no single assessment that meets every need at every level. It just doesn't exist, unfortunately. But we have to think about the different purposes of assessments, how that impacts the design of those assessments, and how that impacts the information and data that comes out of those assessments. So when we think about different types of assessments, I want to go through this list in a bit more detail. Screening assessments is kind of where we start at the beginning, right? Typically, these are relatively short assessments designed to identify if more detailed assessment is needed, or is this a student who's likely to need intervention or be at risk for some kind of deficiency. So we do an initial screening that might help inform or raise a flag for a particular student or group of students who are struggling on a particular topic. We also look at assessments from a diagnostic lens, and that really can be defined in two different ways. First, in the classroom, a diagnostic test will often precede instruction, and it's used to check students' prior knowledge and skill levels to inform the instructor about where students are starting, and it helps to guide teacher planning and determine what instruction needs to happen next. Normally, those results are often not graded. They're not evaluative because they're serving a diagnostic purpose. It's just informing our starting point because we know we have to build from there. Diagnostic assessments can also be used in a different way, which is really the more medical definition of a diagnosis, right? To help identify students' strengths and weaknesses, to dig in and get more information about areas in need of improvement, and to inform next steps for intervention for students. A different purpose for assessment is placement. So placement assessments are often used to determine where students need to enter into in terms of their entry point in the education system. It can be used to determine an instructional level or whether a student needs inclusion in a particular education program. So we might use a placement assessment to determine if a student needs a particular resource or intervention strategy. It also can be used to determine which level of entry a student should be going into. For example, does that student really belong in grade 4 or grade 5 based on where they are in terms of their skills? And they're even used for college entrance. Placement tests are used to determine if students need remedial coursework at the college level, or placements can be used by employers. Placement tests can be used by employers to help determine where a candidate should be fit into the employee pool. Interim assessments are administered typically at intervals between instructional periods that help teachers better understand what a student knows at that point in the curriculum and in the school year, but also what they need. Are they lacking any prerequisite skills or knowledge, and what they're going to be ready for next. It also can help determine progress towards learning goals and measure growth. And it also can help teachers identify patterns or trends for a group of students. Summative assessment, however, is a little bit different. Summative assessments are typically given once at the end of a longer period of instruction. They're typically large-scale assessments, can be given statewide or nationally, but they also could be district-wide or reference end-of-semester or end-of-unit assessments. They're typically used to evaluate performance against a defined set of content standards and to measure and report on overall achievement at a given point. Next, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about formative assessment. Formative assessment is something we hear a lot about, and sometimes that term is used for benchmark or interim assessments, but it's not the same thing. Formative assessments can be both formal assessments or informal practices in the classroom that are used by teachers in the learning process, so right in time during learning, so that they can get feedback about students' understanding and modify their teaching and learning activities to improve instruction and their students' achievement of particular content. Formative assessment typically occurs moment to moment as part of the instruction, and it's a process that's used by teachers and students more frequently. It can be used daily, even multiple times during the school day, or weekly by teachers. So they're considered what we call short cycle assessments. Before we go into a little bit more detail about classroom assessments and different cycle assessments, I wanted to talk briefly about norm-referenced assessments versus criterion-referenced assessments. So norm-referenced assessments is not a particular assessment type, but it is a reference point for interpretation. What it's talking about is that your results are reported in comparison to similar students who've taken the assessment previously, and your performance on that assessment is interpreted relative to a particular norm group. Often that is students at the same grade level. It may be students at the same grade level, but also the same instructional point in the school year. And with a norm-referenced assessment, those tests will yield a percentile rank. It can be a national percentile rank when your norm group is the nation. It also could be a district-based percentile rank, but it's a comparative indicator of how that student performed compared to his or her peers in that norm group. Criterion-referenced assessments, on the other hand, again, it's not a particular assessment, but it's a reference point for interpretation. And assessments that are criterion-referenced are looking to report results in comparison to an absolute standard without regard to how other students perform. So on a norm reference test, you'd see a distribution of scores that follows a particular pattern, with most students scoring in the middle of the distribution, around the 50th percentile. With a criterion reference test, you may see all students reaching a particular cut score or meeting a criteria at that from that assessment, or you may see all students missing that criteria, that they didn't reach that benchmark or standard that's been set for those students. So it's a little bit different way of approaching the design of the assessments, and it informs how you can interpret those results. We've also seen situations where tests that have been designed to be criterion referenced and measured against a standard end up looking a whole lot like norm reference tests in their distribution. But the intent and the design of those assessments is really two different purposes. One for comparison against a norm group, one measuring against a standard or a criteria that's been set for students. So next I want to talk to you a little bit about classroom assessments and the different cycles of assessments that you might see in a particular classroom. And again, I want to emphasize that each of these types of assessments is going to yield different information for the teacher, the school, the district, and the state. So we administer, oftentimes we hear that we're administering too many tests, right? Because students have to take a particular summative assessment at the end of the school year. The classroom teacher might be using formative assessment practices and tests in the classroom, and the district has decided to administer an interim assessment periodically to measure student learning and progress at different points throughout the year. The reason why we have so many different kinds of assessments being given to students is because each of these assessments really answers different questions and helps us understand different things about the student learning. So let me start with kind of the traditional summative assessment, the column that's on the far right of this table here. These are what we consider a long cycle assessment. And it really answers the questions as to whether a student has reached a designated proficiency level, and is that student demonstrating year-to-year growth. So you're looking at that student's performance typically at the end of the school year or at the end of a course, especially at the high school level, and saying, did this student reach the point where we expected him or her to reach? Did they make progress from the time they took this test at the previous grade level last year until the end of this school year? So oftentimes those tests are given at the end of semester or once a year, most often in spring. And what's the impact of those assessments? Those assessments help inform decision makers, particularly at the district and state level, as to is the curriculum that they're using in that district effective? Do we need to make changes to that curriculum? Are instructional materials appropriate for the goals that we're trying to reach at the end of the school year? And it helps inform decisions around managing or allocating materials, resources, staffing, scheduling, all those big systemic decisions that need to be made at the district, school, or even state level oftentimes are informed by our summative assessments. At the opposite end of the spectrum are the short cycle or formative assessments that are given in the classroom. Those are designed as a check to know, for teachers to know, where is each student in their learning right now? The kids sitting in my classroom before me today, where are they in terms of their learning? Did the student sitting before me understand the content that I just taught, this particular unit of instruction that I presented? And oftentimes those are given daily, right, where the teacher, and even multiple times a day, where a teacher can do a check for understanding, or they can be given weekly based on quizzes or small assessments that are given in that classroom to help inform the teacher, again, did these students master the content? Did they develop proficiency on that particular unit of instruction that I've just delivered? And the timing of these is that we want to give them immediately, right, as close to the instruction as possible, so that we can have an impact immediately or within the next day or two, so that I can adjust my instruction, reteach, remediate, approach something differently if my students didn't get that content, if the learning didn't take place as a result of teaching that occurred in the classroom. In the middle column here, we have what is exactly the middle of the road here. It's a medium cycle assessment. And these are often referred to as interim assessments. They happen periodically at certain points in the school year, often between teaching units or at designated points in the school year, fall, winter, spring. And they're designed to answer the questions, is this student on track to achieve those grade level expectations? Are they making the right progress throughout the school year that we expect them to make to put them on the right trajectory to be proficient at that end of year summative assessment? Again, those are given about every 4 to 6 weeks or often each grading period, and they can be used to adjust the curriculum to better address student needs through reteaching or scaffolding. So it's helping a teacher understand, do I have students in my class who are not keeping up with the pace of instruction, the pace of the curriculum that's moving forward? How do I support them by intervening with those students to help them catch up to their peers and stay on track for proficiency? So again, I want to emphasize each of these different categories of assessment yield different information for the teacher, for the school, for the district, for the state. And so often we see multiple types of assessments being administered in schools because different stakeholders need different levels of information to inform the work that's taking place. But as I said at the beginning, the important thing is the action that's taken as a result of these assessments. Assessments administered with no follow-through or no action based on the information that we gather are just an unfortunate poor use of classroom time. I want to talk for a minute about state testing because I know that that's very important to legislators, and talk a little bit about where do states get their summative tests. So these are the end of year tests used for accountability purposes that help us determine, is a student proficient on the grade level expectations we've set, and has the student made progress from one year to the next that indicates they're moving forward on that educational path. So states can typically get their summative assessments one of 3 ways. One is through participation in a group that has collaboratively developed assessments. So those are what we refer to as the consortia assessments. They're things like the Smarter Balanced and PARC assessments that were built as consortia assessments to support the Common Core state standards. But there are also collaboratively developed assessments, for example, for English language proficiency through the WIDA consortium. So there's states often participate in these because it's for efficiency purposes, right? If you have a shared set of standards or expectations for developing English language proficiency, it's nice to have an assessment that's already been developed that several states are participating in that you can get good data on from those assessments. A second way that states get their summative assessments can be through off-the-shelf assessments. And these are tests that are readily available, right? They're built for particular purposes, and states purchase those from a test vendor, a test developer, to be able to use those for their off-the-shelf assessments. This includes things like the ACT assessment or the SAT from College Board, or even the advanced placement assessments. Those are off-the-shelf assessments. And there's also an off-the-shelf assessment for 3 through 8, which is called ACT Aspire, that is pre-built that states can participate in or purchase from that vendor and use for their summative assessments. There's some challenges with these because sometimes they are not as closely aligned to your state standards or expectations as those that are developed through the consortia or a custom assessment that's developed in partnership with a vendor. And that's the third option that's available to states, is to issue a solicitation, go through a procurement process, typically through an RFP, where they get responses back from test vendors, and those vendors respond to the specific needs of that state with a solution that they've developed and will develop in partnership with that state to deliver a summative assessment. Those allow states to customize the content, the length, the standards that they're aligned to, and the design of the assessments. So we see many states moving away from off-the-shelf or even the collaboratively developed assessments through the consortia to customize state-developed tests. Or sometimes what states will do is license content from an available resource bank or item bank, and then use that content to build a state-specific version of the test that's been customized for that state. I want to talk a little bit about what makes a good summative assessment, and particularly how that process has evolved over time, especially from No Child Left Behind until now under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So in the past, right, summative assessments were really designed to measure basic skills and identify minimum proficiencies. Now, state assessments are thinking much more, or targeted much more, to measure higher order thinking. We want to measure more critical thinking and problem solving, not just the basic skills that a student needs to move forward. In the past, some of our assessments were not particularly well aligned to the standards, and now under ESSA, and particularly under the peer review requirements from the U.S. Department of Education, states have to demonstrate that their assessments are closely aligned to their state standards and expectations. And they have to show that connection, demonstrate that connection, so that there's a connection between the assessment that's occurring and the instruction that's taking place based on those standards in the classroom. So you might hear some people talk about if you teach to the standards, you will be successful on the test. You don't need to teach to the test because the test is closely aligned to those standards and the curriculum. In the past, our tests were more designed to measure against the middle of the road, the average student, right, and answer questions about proficiency. Is the student proficient on grade level content? And there was sort of that yes or no answer that delineated proficient students from non-proficient students. Now we see tests really trying to measure the full range of students, from the low end of the spectrum to help students identify where those low performing student needs are, and all the way to the high end of the spectrum for students who would be ready for more challenging content or acceleration. And we have something at NWEA called Computer Adaptive Assessment that helps support that, where the test adjusts to each student to help get a better picture of where that student is on that spectrum of learning. In the past, our summative assessments relied heavily on multiple choice questions, and while we continue to use selected response questions as part of our summative assessments, we're now talking about a number of different question types, even within selected response. So we have something called technology enhanced items, or TEIs, that allow for different kinds of skills to be measured. It allows for multiple answer choices to be correct for a student instead of a single response being the right answer. And we also see summative assessments incorporating constructed response questions, questions that might require a short or a longer extended response from a student. So a writing prompt would be a long extended response, but we even have short answer questions built in, sometimes that are scored through artificial intelligence, sometimes that are scored by human scorers. In the past, our summative assessments relied heavily on manufactured texts, so texts that were written specifically for that assessment, which sometimes created some challenges in that they weren't always the highest quality text that we could possibly be using. Now we're trying to use more excerpts from relevant texts that students might even encounter in their instruction or as they go out into the world and read a variety of different source materials. And we think that's much more effective in helping provide better context for the assessment. That's knowledge that's transferable, and make sure that we're measuring the kinds of things that are important to student performance through high school, college, and even beyond. In the past, we struggled because summative assessments were often not accessible to students who had disabilities or different needs. And there have been a lot of changes in our assessments, particularly as we've moved to computer-based testing, to make our assessments much more accessible to students, including using technology that allows for screen readers for visually impaired students, or different types of text presentation for students who might need that because of different learning disabilities or their certain specific needs. So we're doing our best to make those texts or those assessments accessible to more students in the classroom and mirror the things that they're able to, the tools that they're able to use in instruction so that it's a more seamless experience for students. And lastly, in the past, unfortunately, our summative assessment has been very disconnected from classroom practice, and we still continue to hear complaints around that issue, that the data that comes from the summative assessment doesn't really connect to what's happening in that classroom. But we're working on strategies to make our summative assessments more relevant to that classroom instructional practice, connecting those results, making them the feedback from those summative assessments more timely, and allowing it to guide the information that's used. And I think we're continuing to see an evolution in assessment leading to more innovative solutions that are going to even better address some of these challenges that we've encountered. In the last section of our presentation here, I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities that exist under ESSA and how things have changed a bit for schools and districts since the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act. The first and most important thing that I think came out of ESSA is that there's a strong emphasis on multiple measures, that it's not a single test or a single indicator that is determining accountability, particularly at the school and district level. Of course, proficiency is still at the center of ESSA, and we want to move all students to grade level proficiency, enabling them to be successful in school, college, and career. But ESSA also has a strong growth component and an emphasis on looking at whether students are making progress from year to year and even within the school year for some opportunities. And lastly, ESSA provides for non-academic indicators that are measures of how students are performing and engaging in the school environment, even outside of their academic skills and abilities. We have a number of states who are looking at things like chronic absenteeism as a non-academic indicator of student engagement, as well as states that are looking at things like student survey results and more qualitative aspects of the school environment. Last, I want to talk a little bit about the innovation that's permitted under ESSA. So there are some things that remain unchanged in the ESSA legislation from previous the No Child Left Behind legislation. Those things include annual assessments in English language arts and mathematics to all students in grades 3 through 8, and once in high school, and then once in each grade span for science. So typically you'll see a science assessment at the elementary, middle, and high school level. All students in grades 3 through 8 have to take an English language arts and math test each year, and then there has to be a high school assessment as well. There's requirements about student participation and that are unchanged, which is that 95% of all students must participate in the assessment for accountability purposes. And states were also encouraged to audit their assessments to see if there is duplication or unnecessary assessments that were part of their state plan that they could eliminate. And we've seen states look carefully at this. I think we've seen some states scrutinize district-level selected assessments, particularly interim assessments, as a result of this. But again, I'll remind you, those serve a different purpose than the summative assessments, and that's why districts are choosing to give those and get that feedback throughout the year in addition to the end-of-year summative assessment. If it's implemented statewide, there's some allowances within ESSA for innovation in the general assessment. And for example, providing computer adaptive assessment is allowable under ESSA, as well as using multiple measures throughout the year. So if a state chooses to implement a new summative assessment program that includes computer adaptive testing or includes multiple measures throughout the year, or even both, that's allowable as long as they're doing the same thing statewide. The last thing is there's innovation allowed within a subset of the state's local education agencies or schools under the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority, or IADA, which is commonly referred to as the Innovative Assessment Pilot. And that component, the IADA component, allows the United States Secretary of Education, so Betsy DeVos, to approve pilots or authorize pilots for up to 7 states to implement new and innovative assessments on a small scale, allowing those districts or schools that are a subset or participating in that pilot to avoid double testing by having to take both the pilot assessment and the statewide exam. And so they can choose to have 2 different systems in place for a period of time in the state as they're developing the innovative assessments and scaling them statewide. So they have to develop strategies for scaling those innovative assessments to support the whole state over a 5 to 7 year period. So that supports the development and scaling up time frame. Right now, under IADA, 4 pilots have been approved. The first was actually Louisiana, and then New Hampshire, then North Carolina, and finally Georgia has been approved. And each of these states is approaching the IADA opportunity a little bit differently. Louisiana has decided that they want to focus on developing an innovative assessment that assesses English language arts and social studies content within the same assessment. And we are actually, NWEA is actually working in partnership with the state of Louisiana to support the development of those assessments. They're particularly looking at ways to provide students with exposure to texts, social studies texts, that are taught as part of the curriculum instruction, and then those same texts are used as part of the summative assessment that occurs periodically throughout the year. So they're doing it based on units of instruction and are assessing both those social studies and English language arts standards within the same assessment. New Hampshire is approaching things a little bit differently. What they have done is, and they've been working on this project for several years, they're using performance assessments in the state of New Hampshire. And they started with a very small group of districts and have been building on a voluntary basis towards the ability to support performance assessments statewide. And there is some great information available about the New Hampshire, what they call the PACE assessments, P-A-C-E, that's available through their website and through their resources. North Carolina has decided to move forward with an assessment pilot that will allow them to use multiple assessments administered periodically throughout the year, and then they will aggregate the information gathered through those periodic assessments to determine summative proficiency at the end of the year. They're doing it based on a pacing guide or instructional focus guide that is structured for the state of North Carolina, where they essentially define what's going to be taught in a particular period of time, and then they're going to assess that content moving on to the next set of curriculum and instruction and the next set of assessment of that curriculum content, and then a third set at the end of the year with a spring final assessment, but again designed just to assess that last third of the content in the school year. And then they take the results from the 3 assessments and combine those to determine if a student has reached proficiency at the grade level. Last but not least is Georgia, and Georgia has actually approached this a little bit differently. In the state of Georgia, the state legislature passed Senate Bill 362, which called for districts to propose a pilot program for innovative assessment to ultimately replace the current state assessment known as Georgia Milestones. And there have been 2 pilot programs that came forward to first the State Board of Education, and then the State Department of Education has taken those 2 pilots forward to the U.S. Department of Education and gotten approval to move forward with both of these pilots in the state, with the idea that they're going to test out these 2 different models and see which is most effective and best aligned with the goals of the state of Georgia, and then select one of those at the end of the pilot period to move forward. The first of these assessments is actually something that NWEA is supporting through what we call the GMAP Consortium, which is a group of 9 districts in the state of Georgia who are partnering with NWEA to do what we refer to as a through-year assessment. And that's an assessment that's administered 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. It's a computer adaptive assessment that's designed to measure grade level performance or proficiency for students and extend and adapt above and below grade level to provide instructional feedback. And students will have multiple opportunities throughout the year to demonstrate proficiency on grade level content. And then at the end of the year, there'll be an aggregate score, a combined score, that pulls information from each administration to yield that summative proficiency score. The other pilot is an assessment called NAVI, and they are working with the Putnam Consortium, led by Putnam County in Georgia, which is very short, standards-focused assessments that are administered in alignment with the instruction that's occurring. And again, all of those assessments are compiled at the end of the year. So there's 1 per standard for each grade level and content area that's assessed. And through the NAVI system, the information from each of those standards-based assessments will be gathered together at the end of the year to provide a summative proficiency indicator. So Georgia's got 2 pilots going on in their state, recognizing that the feds have informed them that at the end of the process, Georgia will have to make a decision and adopt one of those statewide to scale up and move forward with going ahead. I have one more slide, and then I see we have some questions in the chat, so we'll be sure to get to those. So I did want to end the conversation today with a little bit of some suggestions, some helpful hints, right, for policymakers who are involved in this process. I think it's really important for policymakers to think about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and define those objectives for the folks at your state level, particularly your State Department of Education, who are responsible for executing to those objectives or desired outcomes. Oftentimes, the folks in the Education Department or the State Board of Education will have specific areas of expertise and that expertise is important in the decision-making process, but what's vital is that policymakers need to help define those outcomes or those particular objectives that you want to achieve for the state, and then hold the State Department and State Board of Education accountable to those. I think it's really important that legislators continue to engage with your State Department of Education and other assessment experts Certainly, it's a complex topic. We've talked a lot today about different types of assessments, different purposes of assessments, how they can be designed and built and developed, item types, all of that. So please rely heavily on those that have that expertise and that can help you understand the key issues and what what kinds of objectives and outcomes you should be defining for your state. I think it's truly important that states remember that you don't have to start from scratch. There are other states out there doing different things. We talked about 4 states that are participating in the innovative assessment pilot. It's great to be able to see from examples of what other states are doing, ideas that might be beneficial and align with the goals and objectives that you have for your state. And then lastly, I always think it's really important that we, throughout this process, whether you're in you're working in the test development side, as I am, whether you're working in a state department of education or in the legislature, that we really need to get feedback from all stakeholders at each of those levels and make certain that teachers have input into this process, because it's so impactful to teachers and it can really make or break their experience. And we've seen so many instances recently of teacher shortages and challenges filling those critical positions that we need to help support our education system. And I think having teachers be part of that process and contribute to the information that's used to decide how we're going to move forward is so critical, and they often have the best ideas because they're the ones closest to the students. So that's my little soapbox pitch there. I do want to go into the chat and see what kind of questions we have and ask Michelle if there's anything that she'd like me to start with or anything that she thinks is critical that we talk about in our last few minutes here.
Thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. And as a reminder, we archive all of our webinars. So if there's anything that you didn't get, or if you need to go back and visit this, or if you want to share that link with your colleagues who may not have been able to participate, we will have that link available, and you'll be able to do that. So yes, let's just go ahead and begin to answer some of these questions. The first one from Janet Elliott says, how important is it for a summative assessment to be written at the appropriate reading level for a specific grade? That's a really great question.
Yeah, thanks for asking that one. It's obviously vitally important, right, that the reading passages that are selected as part of the summative assessment and the content that's presented to students be appropriate for their grade level. In the assessment development process, there are a number of checks that occur to ensure that's the case. But we also know there's a range, right, for each grade level, that there are going to be some students who are at the low end of that range and some students who are at the high end. And in all likelihood, the assessment is going to mirror that, right? There are going to be some content and passages that are written that are very easily digestible and understood by students at that grade level, and then some that are going to be more challenging. And that allows us to assess across the spectrum of performance because it helps inform how well students do with challenging content and the things that are at the higher depth of knowledge levels.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Natalie Heath, and it was about something that you have talked a bit about or went into some detail about with regard to the innovative assessment pilots. She was specifically referencing Georgia. She's wondering if there's any cautions here with states moving down this path, if there's any negatives that we should be aware of, or is this a positive development in those states that are moving toward these innovative assessments?
Sure. Again, really terrific question. I think, I certainly think that as we look at the way that assessments are evolving over time, we need to be looking at how do we better meet the needs of stakeholders from a single assessment, right? And really, when we think about the rationale or reasons for moving away from a single end-of-year summative test to assessments that occur throughout the year that then can layer on or provide information about summative proficiency. I think there's some value in that because you're getting feedback more frequently, enabling teachers to adjust instruction more appropriately, and you're potentially reducing testing time in a place where you might have been administering an interim assessment throughout the year to get that periodic feedback in addition to a summative assessment at the end of the year to evaluate proficiency. If we can combine those purposes and yield that kind of information or feedback from a single solution, I think we're helping to save some instructional time in the classroom, which is always beneficial. But you're absolutely right. There are likely some risks to this strategy, right? And ensuring that we provide ample opportunity to learn the content that's being taught before the assessment is given. And we have to be very thoughtful and planful about that to ensure that we aren't compromising the goals that we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Thank you for answering that question. Our next question comes from Tim Mathis, and he's wondering if you have information on assessment cost variations among states and how states go about paying for those. That's something NCSL can provide information on, and I'm curious if you have any resources on that at NWEA.
I know we've gathered some information about that over the years, particularly looking at information that is available through Freedom of Information Act requests to states about their state contracts. But it's not something that I have at my fingertips that I could share with you. So if that's something, Michelle, that you could have your folks dig into and provide some ranges for that, I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, we will see what we can find. I think as you alluded to, those are, that information is found in state contracts, so sometimes that's hard to come by. But we will see if we can find any resources and share it with you. Tim. I think we have time for one more question for sure. We'll get to this one from Dave Thoman. Can you discuss the difference between assessing for the sake of tracking student development versus evaluating teacher performance?
Sure. I think there's instances where we see assessments able to do both, right? And I would certainly say some of the interim assessments that are available are able to effectively measure student performance, but also measure growth and progress, which I would say is the best indicator of teacher performance, right? If we look at effectiveness of teachers in terms of whether they are moving students and their students in their classes are making appropriate growth, reaching growth goals each year. That's the best way, I think, of supporting teacher evaluation, as opposed to measuring teacher effectiveness against a student proficiency benchmark, which often is influenced heavily by where students started at the beginning of the year. It determines whether they reach proficiency or not during that school year. So I think there's certainly assessments that are able to do both. I think it's important to think about considerations of how do we define teacher effectiveness when we build those assessment components into teacher evaluation.
And we have one last question. Kimberly, is your organization primarily focused on computer adaptive testing, or do you have both approaches available?
So primarily we focus on computer adaptive testing. We at NWEA, we really strongly believe that computer adaptive testing makes the best use of testing time to be able to gauge where students are on their learning trajectory. We also think that it allows you to better measure student progress and growth throughout the year. But there have been instances, and we actually provide a summative assessment for the state of Nebraska, which is what we call minimally adaptive. It's really focused on grade level expectations with some small adaptivity built in. But NWEA is a strong proponent of computer adaptive testing, and we really believe that's best for students and for teachers.
Thank you so much. So with that, today we will conclude today's webinar. If you need any additional information or resources, you can feel free to reach out to me, Michelle Ekstrom at NCSL. And if you would like to be put in touch with Kimberly, we can do that as well. Look for additional information and resources on this topic from NCSL. We will continue to partner with NWEA and other experts in this field to continue to build your expertise around this complicated and sometimes challenging topic. We're here to help you. Have a good day. Thank you.